Grazie Presidente. Apologize for being a little bit late, but I was sharing with the chairs of delegations our common work. Here is one. I was faster than him. Last time we have met here in this hemicycle to discuss our common work on the Middle East peace process and on Israel and Palestine, it was only 6 weeks ago. And we all agreed back then on something, that the stalemate in the peace process, the lack of peace process indeed, could only lead to more violence. And this is what we're seeing today. It has happened time and again, and it is happening in dramatic ways in these last weeks. The new wave of violence and terror is affecting innocent Israelis and Palestinians. There is not and there cannot be any excuse for terror. Incitement and violence must end. The response of security forces needs to be proportionate and consistent, regardless of who is the perpetrator. It is now mostly up to the political leaders on the two sides to get out of the current impasse and to show leadership. Most of all, to show leadership. Showing leadership is much more difficult when the situation gets more difficult, but it's also when it's more needed. Both leaderships have a responsibility to promote calm, to contain the situation of violence and to promote calm. They have an interest in doing this for their own people. And they have a general responsibility towards the region, and I would say towards the rest of the world, to make sure that the situation doesn't inflame on the religious level and get spread all across the globe. Last week, I met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Just yesterday evening in Brussels, I met President Abbas to pass exactly the same message. You need to take leadership, strong positions, and try to calm down the situation on the ground first and foremost. And the international community is and will be with you in this respect. They acknowledge that they need to work together in partnership to end the current unrest. And this is something relevant, but also something that needs to be tested for real. Obviously, our thoughts today and in these days are with all the victims, with all the families, with all the people that are suffering on the ground. But as we try to de-escalate the crisis, we must not lose sight of the underlying causes of tensions, the frustrations, the sense of insecurity, the lack of hope, the lack of political horizon. Without that political horizon, any de-escalation that we might even get, as difficult as it can be, will only last for a limited time, and we will go back again and again and again to the cycle of violence. We said this last year at the end of the conflict in Gaza. We are here 1 year later saying the same. Our first priority must be to build the conditions for final status talks based on mutual steps. For this to happen, we need significant policy shifts on the ground. And we need these policy shifts to happen in line with past agreements that are there and need to start being implemented. We have to find an entry point to the process, to have the process restarting again. When we say this, it's not just a reference to restarting the political process, restarting the talks, restarting negotiations. We all know very well, and the Israelis and the Palestinian people know that very well, that talks for talks, negotiations for negotiations would not bring anything real on the ground unless we in parallel create the conditions, the real conditions for the people to live, first of all to live, and secondly to live better their respective lives. When we talk about this, so we talk about concrete steps in the context of a political process. De-escalating the security aspect, violence, implementing concrete steps on the ground in line with prior agreements, and creating the conditions for the political horizon. These are three elements we need to work in parallel on, with the support of the international community. We talk about measures that help the Palestinians take control over their lives and upholding Israel's security, not just for negotiating, not just for the sake of doing something, but to reach concrete results. These goals must be pursued in parallel. The escalation on the ground, concrete steps to implement agreements that have already been signed, that are there already, and keeping the perspective of the political horizon of the final settlement. These three elements must go together, and I think this is more urgent than ever. In New York last month and in Vienna last Friday, all the Quartet principals passed this message loud and clear. And let me say that it was the European Union choice to invest in the Quartet as a format for international backing of these efforts. From this recent round of meetings, including with Secretary of State Kerry in Berlin, I retain the commitment of Prime Minister Netanyahu to guarantee the status quo of the holy sites and the desire of all parties to de-escalate the situation on the ground. I also welcome and support Secretary Kerry's initiative to address the situation in the holy sites, highlighting the role of Jordan in this, which is key. In the next few weeks, the Quartet envoys will engage directly with the parties. It is now up to the Israeli and the Palestinian leadership to demonstrate, with acts, that their commitment to the two-state solution is real and not just fake, not just a slogan. If Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas fail now to work together, if they don't cooperate to stop the violence, if they don't rebuild a credible political process, the situation for their own people will get only worse and worse. The regional context is as tense as it could be, even if this is a sentence we should never say because it could also always turn worse. But we don't want to see an old conflict as this one mix with the newer crisis in the neighbouring countries. The conditions around Israel and Palestine are today much, much more dangerous than they used to be decades ago. This is a risky time also and mainly for the people in Israel and in Palestine alike. And if the leaderships don't understand that now, that it's not business as usual even in the management of the old conflict we are all used to, let me use this because we never got used to a conflict that is bringing so many deaths and sufferings, if they don't realize that it is more urgent today to solve this, more important today to solve this, then there will be little things that the international community can really do to support the process. And the mix of old and new, of history and religious elements in this moment in the region would be explosive, not only for the people involved, for all. Peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians is an interest we all share in the region and beyond. And it is for this reason that we invited on, again, European initiative, key Arab countries to join our Quartet meetings. Think of how relevant can Egypt be for Gaza, and Jordan for the holy places, which is something we are seeing every day, and Saudi Arabia for relaunching the Arab Peace Initiative and adapting it to these times. Only in a renewed regional framework, peace is possible. Arab partners have stressed to me their readiness to work with the Quartet in the coming months. We actually have started already to work together with them, but like us, they need to see determined leadership by the parties. We can build all the international and regional support, but they have to take responsibility for showing leadership inside. First of all, inside their own societies and inside their own communities. Recent events should serve as a warning. If anyone still believes that we can just manage the current crisis, contain it a little bit, and wait for the next one to come, they're wrong. This is not going to continue like this. Every cycle of violence is going to be worse than the previous one, and this will destroy the Middle East. So now is decision time. Israeli and Palestinian leaders will have to take courageous choices, difficult ones, but this is the only path they have towards peace. They can either move forward or watch chaos prevail in their own societies. This is the message I have been passing personally to the two leaders, together with my quoted colleagues and with my Arab friends. This is the line on which we are all committed to work. And I have asked both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas to receive the Quartet envoys in the coming days, not weeks, days, to start working together on concrete steps that can be immediately taken on the ground to de-escalate on one side and to improve the living conditions of the people. We have to find this entry point, because talks for talks, the big horizon, today, I don't see the conditions internally in the two societies to allow the leaderships to invest credibly in this, while the security situation is as it is, and while the confidence needs to be built. So we need to find first and foremost this entry point, making sure that at the end of the process the two-state solution is preserved and not prejudged, but we have to help them start implementing issues on the ground that can deliver for the people, for the ordinary people that today are seeing their children dying on both sides, with different numbers, but on both sides, to start having a future in their lands. Thank you.
Grazie, Vicepresidente.
Thank you very much indeed, Vice President Mogherini. And now I call Ms. Gabriel on behalf of the EPP.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Vice President, I'd like to thank you for your personal commitment to this issue. Your message today has been very clear. We need more good news.
Okay. Madame la Représentante, je recommence.
Let me start again. Madam Vice President, I'd like to congratulate you on your personal commitment on this issue. Your message is very clear, though of course we'd like more good news. But your statements ooze pragmatism and realism. The recent rise in violence needs to be seen from a different point of view. It's not just something that stops the negotiations recommencing, but actually it could be seen as a way of bringing the two parties together. The internal divisions in both camps and extremist positions in both camps cannot be deemed an obstacle to progress, and it's vital that the leaders on both sides have to demonstrate their commitment to peace, not just to the international community, but also internally when they address their own people and steer them towards a peaceful two-state solution. Secondly, you warn them, yes, if the Israeli-Palestinian internal situation is not favorable, then you have to look very closely at the region. But once again, maybe there are opportunities out there. On the one hand, we have the Arab countries committed to fighting terrorism. We have the recent agreement with Iran on nuclear. Perhaps there are levers, perhaps there are ways of restarting peace negotiations. The Quartet has recently highlighted the role of Jordan, but we also have the Arab countries initiative that dates back to 2002. I'd like to thank you and assure you of the entire unequivocal support of this House for everything you're doing. Thank you.
Microphone, please.
Sì. Purtroppo il conflitto tra Israele.
Unfortunately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still alive, and until we find a solution, the whole of the Middle East will be like a kind of tree poisoned at the roots by this conflict. The violence of the last few weeks has shown us there's a lost generation of Palestinians, people who were born after Oslo and have never actually known the hope of peace. The role of the Union should be to give those people hope again, and so rhetoric isn't enough. We need deeds. We agree with your strategy, Ms. Mogherini. You are doing work behind the scenes, but it's exceptionally valuable. It's quite right that you are focusing, I think, on these goals. De-escalation. Secondly, getting the political initiative restarted. The agreements on conserving the status quo as far as mosques in Jerusalem is concerned is a step forward. We can't lose Jerusalem. But there are two crucial elements which need to happen if we are to resume negotiations. There is a common enemy for all sides, extremist violence. And it's not just ISIS, but also the practice of hatred by the extremists on the Israeli and the Palestinian sides. Secondly, we have need for two states, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, which would be along the borders of 1967, with Jerusalem being the capital of both states. If we want to save Israel and Palestine from more war, we need to save them from themselves, or from their own worst sides, those who are working as Penelope used to work in the Odyssey, the Ulysses' wife, who, to avoid another wedding, undid the work she did weaving in the day during the night. Israel and Palestine are destroying what they have themselves slowly built up. When it seems that peace is within touching distance, that is when these bad forces emerge and stop that goal being achieved. Israel and the European Union in the year 2000 concluded an association agreement which doesn't simply deal with financial issues, but where both sides committed themselves to respect human rights and democracy. The European Union needs to be a guarantor for that commitment and tell all sides what their historic task is: to transform the enemy into a friend, the fanatic into a moderate, the person who wants revenge into a friend. Thank you very much.
Mr. Pittella, there is a blue card for you from Mr. Etheridge. Are you ready to? Okay. Mr. Etheridge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the blue card, sir. It may have been an error of translation, but it appeared to come through my earphones that you just then made a comparison between Israel and ISIS. It appeared that you compared a beacon of democracy in the Middle East, which is under constant attack, to a barbaric terrorist organisation. If you didn't do that, could you please clarify, because I'm sure you wouldn't want to compare the two things, which are totally different.
No problem. Let me just tell you what I wrote again, so there can't be any misunderstandings. Europe, Israel and Palestine today have a common enemy: ISIS. Not just ISIS, as I said, also the more extreme forces on the Palestinian side. So Israel is on one side and ISIS is the enemy of Israel and Palestine, and indeed all of us.
Now it's clear, and now to Mrs. Fotyga, the floor is yours.
Dziękuję.
Thank you. The rise of radicalism in the Islamic world is a threat to us, but it's also a threat to people in Hebron and Jerusalem. The nuclear agreement with Iran was for Israel what the reset with Russia was for my region. There is a need to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The quartet and Mr. Netanyahu are indeed making efforts. We need to see something from the Palestinian side and President Abbas. We need both sides round the table, and we need them to understand that at this critical time, an agreement could be in the interest of the international community and both countries in the face of extremism. Thank you. And the next speaker is Mr. VAUTMANS.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter, mevrouw de hoge vertegenwoordiger.
Thank you very much, President. High Representative, allow me to start by thanking you for your drive, your commitment and your unparalleled approach. Since September, as you have said yourself, the situation has become more and more desperate. We've seen violence which we condemn on all sides, but we know very well where the most recent violence has come from, and we really do need to insist that there is respect for the sacred site of the Temple Mount. It's important that you speak actively with the leaders and that you try to find points of stability and entry point as you describe. I'm glad to see that the quartet and the other countries in there agree with the European Union, but I think the thing is we all realise that we need more initiatives. We need much more. We need bilateral contacts. We need absolutely every possible entry point we can achieve, and this is why our group and our group chairman has sent you a letter which I'd like to think you've received, madam, and the letter we've sent you actually appeals to you to develop a genuine peace initiative. What we as Liberals would like to see is you encouraging the quartet to try to bring the parties to the conflict together, to go a bit further than the usual shuttle diplomacy, which has not borne fruit as yet in any event. We would really like to see, if Abbas thinks that the Oslo Accords are dead, that we could achieve something to replace them. We need something that gives some prospect of peace to Israeli and Palestinian citizens and a prospect of a future to their children. So we feel very strongly about this, and we've put all these points in our resolution. We want you to use all the influence you have, the huge amount of credit that you have managed to bank, because you have undoubtedly done this in the months you have been in your post. Let's see if you can get a Mogherini deal to replace the Oslo agreements. You have our every support, madam. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Ms. Anderson.
Whilst I welcome any initiative to try and bring peace and stability to the region, the recent joint Israeli and Jordanian proposal won't solve the underlying issues, nor will it result in a lowering of the tension on the ground. Placing recording devices around the Alaska mosque won't assist in creating a shared, peaceful Jerusalem. Neither will they address the incredible rise in settlers' violence or the ongoing occupation of the West Bank and the seas of Gaza. We must not allow Israel to divert attention away from its ongoing breaches of international humanitarian law by turning this into a religious conflict. And that is what restricting access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque is designed to do. Placing Palestine under international protection is a necessary first step towards lowering tension and ultimately peace. And Ms Mogherini, the international community must also demonstrate our commitment with action, because talk with talk is simply a lot of waffle, and it will not help the Palestinian people nor the Israelis.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Auken.
Thank you, Madam High Representative. I'm sure that this conflict is in your core address, and you have issued a lot of statements again, but again, as I heard it now, you're treating the two partners as they are equal. You don't mention the word occupation with one single word, and if we don't address the occupation, nothing will happen, and the credibility of this House and the EU institution will vanish. Since your appointment, the situation on the ground has gone from very bad to worse, and it can get even worse, and you know that. I do not hold you responsible for the decade-long violence on the ground, but I do hold you accountable for not taking tangible and meaningful steps within your reach. Why have you further delayed the publication of the EU guidelines on the labelling of the products for the settlers? Why haven't you taken any visible actions in response to the destruction of EU and Member State-funded projects in Area C? Which steps have you taken to create a blacklist of violent settlers and ban their entry, a measure that has been raised by many Member States many times in recent years? Why haven't we heard any public statement from your side regarding Israel's blacklisting of an entire institution, this Parliament, for granting access to the poor people in Gaza? There is a whole range of actions that could be taken by Brussels and yourself immediately and independently from ongoing negotiations. I urge you to now address this occupation. Let me, last but not least, mention a strong and efficient step to take within EU existing legislation, a consequent differentiation between Israel and the illegal settlements, where we cut all cooperation with settlers and settlements. This differentiation is not a boycott, it's a legal mean which could boost real, credible negotiations. Thank you.
Kiitoksia. Ja seuraavana edustaja Castaldo.
Mr. Castaldo is next, please.
Grazie, Presidente. Terza intifada.
Thank you, Madam President. Is this an intifada or just an escalation? When we see that dialogue is disappearing and the Hamas extremist rhetoric on one side and the tough line from Mr. Netanyahu on the other, and the steps taken against the people in East Jerusalem, perhaps we've already reached the point of no return. People talk about return to the status quo, but they seem to be unaware that they're not dealing with the roots of the problem. Hundreds of Palestinians have died in the last few months. As you said, Madam High Representative, no more business as usual. I'm sure that you're doing all you possibly can in your silent diplomacy, but I also think that it's time to take a political position that's clear and public, treating both sides equally. We're Israel's main commercial partner that has an occupying role in part of this area and has a huge responsibility. Let's do something. Let's take initiatives as a European Union with a peace mission, working in the occupied territories authorized by the United Nations, run by the European Union. The Five-Star Movement is proposing this, but we know it won't be easy, but perhaps it could be the beginning of the move in the right direction.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Borghezio, please.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. I too think that it is absolutely essential for us to have incisive action. The European Union could be much more effective. I think that the High Representative could certainly achieve some more visible results. Let us hope so. The Intifada and the murderous intent that we have seen is based on absolute religious hatred. History shows us that it has been difficult for Muslims and Christians to live together for many, many years in this territory. I'm not sure that we have yet identified what the right way forward is. I'm not sure that we've actually got the parties we need around the table we need. I think that perhaps we are continuing to talk about a two-state solution, but this is only hypocrisy. I don't know whether the two leaders have any belief in a two-state solution whatsoever. Therefore, I think that we need to find a much more incisive approach and work much more on a focused attempt to find a solution. I think Europe is unaware of the reality, and the reality is very, very dangerous. It's paving the way to extremism, to huge dangers for everybody, not least ourselves.
Thank you, and now we're going to hear from Ms. Dodds.
Thank you, Madam President. It has been my long-term belief that we must respect Israel's sovereign right to defend its borders and people from terrorism. It is also essential that we are mindful of the pain and suffering felt by those in Gaza, and as a consequence we must act to do all that we can to help bring stability and a lasting peace to the region. Yet what we have seen in recent weeks has been an upsurge in the number of senseless knife attacks carried out indiscriminately by Palestinians. That some as young as 16 years of age are involved in such attacks is deeply worrying for the future of the region. While we must remain an independent arbiter in this conflict, it is essential that that quest for balance does not equate to appeasement or inaction. We must stand with those committed to democratic principles and tackle the inherent incitement to violence so ingrained in the region. Next week marks 20 years since the assassination of former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who notably once said, "Yes to peace, no to violence." 2 decades on, his words ring more true than ever. Let us stand with those who want peace, and let us ensure our actions give neither credence nor comfort to those engaged in violence.
Thank you, Mr. Preda. Next, please. Thank you very much, Madam President, Madam High Representative. Less than 2 months ago, here in this House, we adopted a comprehensive text on the role of the EU in the Middle East peace process. And here we are again, returning to this debate because there has been an escalation of violence. In the current Middle East situation, with rising tensions and conflicts in Israel's neighborhood, this violence that has recently happened is exacerbating the instability in the region. I therefore turn to the Israeli leadership, calling upon them to stop stoking violence and to stand up to extremism. Otherwise, we'll not be able to break the vicious circle of hatred and division. Moreover, dialogue has to be resumed because only a political solution is possible. We can't have President Abbas saying month after month that he's too tired to enter into this dialogue. Thank you.
Kiitoksia.
Thank you. And now Mr. Boștinaru has the floor.
Madam Chair, Madam High Representative, last time when discussing about the perspectives of peace process and the role of EU, we were showing full unconditional support to your action. Now, when discussing the crisis, the two sides in Israel are only numbering their deaths and wounded people in their camps. We are, of course, highly concerned about the new wave of escalation, somehow anticipated, between the Israelis and Palestinians over the past weeks. The criminal actions and the retaliations not only bring additional affliction to the population, but they are endangering the peace process. The only conclusion to the stabbings, car rammings and shooting attacks is that the reality on the ground is not viable today. And the violence always leads to more violence. Only positive steps, cooperation and concrete engagement on the ground could bring improvements for the security and the reassurance for the population on both sides. Therefore, I welcome your recent efforts, including the cooperation with the US State Secretary John Kerry and the role of some EU foreign ministers and the very united and effective Quartet Principles meeting in Vienna, which shows the need to speak united, to speak single voice in order to be relevant for the two sides. And equally, we reiterate together with you that the two leaders have to show responsibility to show restraining leadership, to contain the rhetoric that could inflame easily not only the situation on the ground but also in the whole region. The security situation on the ground is different today, and it's much more dangerous than ever before if the conflict will still remain unaddressed, unresolved. We continue to support the two-state solution that must guarantee full respect for the dignity of the individuals on both sides, the rights of ethnic and religious minorities as equal citizens in their countries, in both states. Without negotiations, there is no solution. Without a solution, there will be no peace, and the violation will only continue. And one final call on the Palestinian friends. Please stop your divisions. Please start building your legitimate leadership to be our interlocutor for peace and talks and negotiations. We need interlocutors on both sides. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Tannock, please.
Let's be clear here that the lone wolf attacks being committed by Palestinians against Israeli soldiers and civilians are terrorist attacks. We must uphold the right of Israel to defend itself against such attacks, and the right of Israel also over the fact that the perpetrators that are responsible are not basically in any way able to claim this is a legitimate attack on innocent civilians. In fact, they are jihadi extremists espousing an ideology that is inspiring the actions of more, unfortunately. As US Secretary Kerry speaks out of the possibility now of a third intifada and the exchange of rocket attacks between Israel and the West Bank is increasing, the situation is looking ever more fragile. De-escalating tensions is vital, and the international community must reassert the need for a return to peace talks, particularly the Arab Peace Initiative put forward in 2002 as the best item on the table as we speak. So I commend the High Representative's idea of inviting all sides to talks under the Middle East Quartet mandate. Furthermore, concluding the Middle East peace process with a viable two-state solution would be a huge step in defeating the poisonous ideology espoused by ISIS that is also ravaging the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nart, please. Mr. Nart, please.
Microphone, please.
Gracias. Gracias, señora.
Thank you, Madam President. Ms. Mogherini, it's astonishing that you think that the problem is violence. Violence is just a symptom. The problem is occupation. 50 years of occupation is simply an abnormal situation. It's a humiliation. It's exploitation. It makes life impossible for people who were born and have grown up and are continuing to be born and grown up under occupation. That's why we had Oslo, but that's leading nowhere. The Oslo plan itself is now 24 years old and is leading nowhere because it tries to equate the impossible, that the jailer is negotiating with his prisoner. If you look at the 47 map of Palestine and 67 and the present one and post-Oslo, you'll see that little by little Palestine is being whittled away to nothing. And to say that the solution is negotiation between the two sides is not to realise that since Oslo, colonisation has doubled in the occupied territories. That's the fact. And that can't be changed by policies or words. So if we have impossible bilateral negotiations, and years have shown that it is impossible, what the international community needs to do is shoulder its responsibilities and come up with a definitive plan which would end the occupation and have two states with safe, recognised borders on the basis of 1967, bearing in mind that the international community will have to accept the fourth Geneva Convention violation, i.e. colonisation, and would have an apparently equal exchange of territories, which in itself is a violation of international law, but that is at least being realistic. If we want to see the international community, the EU, do something, don't forget the EU is a major partner of the two sides, otherwise we'll still be having more violence and we'll just continue talking about nothing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nart.
Answer a question, blue card. There is a blue card for you. Are you ready to answer? Okay. Edustaja ZZANYI.
Mr. Gianni has the floor.
ZZANYI.
Mr. Szanyi has the floor.
Köszönöm szépen a lehetőséget, képviselő úr.
Thank you. You mentioned reasons that go back 50 years, and there are others who could come up with reasons going back 100 years, 200 years, or 500 years. But why do you think that Ms. Mogherini is responsible for these historical reasons? And my question is whether you agree with me that we have to start now, sit down to negotiate now, and unilateral measures should be avoided at this stage. La historia me apasiona, pero me apasiona mucho más la vida de...
I love history, but I prefer life in the present, and what that means is that, you know, if you can imagine living under occupation is normal, well, that really is living with oppression. After 50 years of occupation and 20 years after Oslo, anyone with any sort of experience would realize that impossible negotiations between the parties are not the solution, but rather the international community must put an end to occupation, the end to humiliation. Humiliation, occupation, those are words used by Barack Obama in Cairo 4 to 5 years ago.
Kiitoksia. Ja seuraavana...
Thank you. Our next speaker now.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, Madam High Representative, there is nothing more serious for the Palestinian and Israeli people than the respect of international law, and that international law will only be upheld if the European Union acts together with the US and a number of Arab countries. Moreover, false symmetries must not be drawn, because what violence are we talking about here? There's not a colonizer and those that are colonized. There is a people with its state, the Israeli people, and the other to whom a state is refused, whose lands are being and water are being stolen, whose houses are being demolished, who are being imprisoned, and there is a wall being built and that are being fought against. And there's no peace if you don't face up to Israeli colonizing. The European Union has to state that and act consequently. They must suspend the association agreement and associated programs, which often end up in military outcomes. And in the interests of the two peoples, Madam, you must now act to set up an international protection force for the Palestinian people under the aegis of the UN, which would provide security for the Israeli people at the same time. Thank you.
Mr. Le Yarrick, there is a blue card for you. Are you ready to answer? There is Mr. Carver. There is a blue card for you. Are you ready? Okay, please. Then, Mr. Gardner.
Thank you for taking my blue card question. You raised the points calling for international action to be taken by the United States, by the European Union and by Arab states. Now, bearing in mind many of those Arab states don't actually recognise the State of Israel, and you speak of security and confidence for the Israeli people as well, how can such action genuinely offer security and safety for the Israeli people? It is a huge contradiction.
Le Yarrick, s'il vous plaît.
De toute façon, quand on...
If you don't want to sort out a problem, you use the argument that you are currently using at the moment. You just need to bring together the United Nations Security Council and to follow the massive majority of countries who henceforth have decided to recognize the Palestinian state. What we are calling for, and the European Union together with the US hold the key for, is that bring together a certain number of Arab countries. This has happened in the past, including Egypt. We could get them around a table to protect the Palestinian people, to recognize the state of Palestine, and to start decolonization. That would be the start of peace.
There is another blue card, Mrs. Mrs. Nart. Mr. Nart. Are you ready to... There is another blue card. Yes, please, Mr. Nart.
I would ask the following. Are you familiar with the Saudi initiative taken a few years ago and an older initiative taken by the Arab League suggesting full recognition to Israel, normalization of cultural, trade relations, open borders, if they could comply with a very basic requirement, which was withdrawal from the occupied territories?
It wasn't for you the question, so that if you want to answer, you can, but... Microphone, please. Microphone.
I thought it was on. I've heard those very initiatives mentioned. I support them. Anything that would help the recognition of the Palestinian state come about and that would contribute to the security of the two peoples, the creation of the state of Palestine within the 67 borders, with the recognition of East Jerusalem as the capital, and not as happens today, where we have conditions created for Jerusalem to be out of the future Palestinian state. We support all of those initiatives, of course.
Merci. Ja nyt edustaja Durand.
Thank you. Mr. Durand.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam President. High Representative, you condemned violence perpetrated against all civilians on both sides. You are quite right. We fully endorse that sentiment. Now, there is a root cause to such acts of violence. Now, you called on both sides to show responsibility. You were quite right to do so. But let us not duck our own responsibilities. The root cause of these difficulties is occupation of territories and breaches of the fundamental rights of an entire people. The European Union has a privileged agreement with the State of Israel. The European Union would not allow its funding to be used for colonization and settlement of occupied territories, purchase of weapons and drones. The European Union would not accept that for any other partner country. So, High Representative, tell me, when will the European Union once and for all agree to review the cooperation agreement with the State of Israel so that we can put an end to settlement, occupation and the increasing number of settlements in occupied territories? Thank you. Thank you. Mr. de Graaf.
Madam President, the hatred and death lust by Palestinians against the Jewish people has burst out again only recently, over the past few weeks. Prime Minister Netanyahu was quite right to point to the historical continuity of this. This wave of death lust is not about contentious territory or the settlement policy or the glorious role of the Temple Mount for the Jewish people. He drew attention to the evil ideology of the terrorist Muslim Brothership and the Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, who took part in the Armenian genocide, organised pogroms in Jerusalem, and in 1941 called on Adolf Hitler to eradicate or to exterminate all the Jews in Europe. Anti-Semitism is one of the core values of Islam, and the modest reaction by Israel makes it into a beacon of humanity in the bestial world of Islam. We must stop all Palestinian financial support for Palestinians. Israel deserves our unconditional support.
Thank you. Mr. Myanmar. We are very concerned about the rise in violence and tension in Jerusalem. We have seen fatalities and rising mistrust between the two sides. The peace process is stymied. The international community has organised a number of meetings in recent days, the Quartet, the Security Council. John Kerry was present, as were you, Mrs. Mogherini. You met with Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu recently. I welcome such efforts to restore calm and security to the region and to kickstart a new peace or political process. We need to work towards political solution negotiated involving both sides. We need to identify possible solutions to the crisis. Experience in recent years have shown that the two sides are not capable of reaching a solution alone. They need impetus and involvement of the international community. We need an international framework in place to support any such process. We need consensus within the international community and consensus on the part of the main players within the region. The Quartet, broadened or enlarged quartet, would be the best framework for such negotiations to ensure a finalised agreement and put an end to the conflict once and for all. We need to break the current impasse. It is in the interests of no one. It will only lead to more violence and terror. Thank you.
Kiitoksia ja seuraavana edustaja Hope.
Thank you. Mr. Howitt.
Mr. President, the High Representative has the Socialist and Democrat Group's support when she calls for talks in days, not months, that this is a decision time and that there must be no fake commitment to a two-state solution. On the religious layer to the conflict, it seems that the preservation of the status quo may have been saved. But is this not a further example of us diffusing yet another additional aspect to the conflict, new provocations, temporary solutions, making us part of the cycle of violence, rather than ourselves contributing to solving its underlying causes? On the violence itself, Ms Mogherini is right to recognise that the different sides experience different numbers of deaths. But as I listen in my own despair at the despair which fuels the violence, when I hear the rapidity with which commentators talk about a third intifada, I want to note today that this is not yet organised violence, and if the international community puts the same rapidity into seeking solutions as to predictions of a third intifada, perhaps that would do best to avert it. Ms Mogherini, you were right to talk to us about Palestinians and Israelis respecting and implementing past agreements. But that has to go to for Europeans too. And I join with colleagues in welcoming the commitment you gave to the Foreign Affairs Committee to finally publish the guidelines on labelling of produce from illegal settlements. And tonight I ask you to set a deadline for this to be completed. My group believes that refraining from doing so doesn't advance the prospect of talks, but doing so, showing that the failure to advance a peace process has consequences from us too. And President, last week I talked with Muslim community representatives in my own region, in the towns of Cambridge, Harlow and Luton, and they retold me what we should understand. The grievances are not only felt in Israel and Palestine. De-radicalisation within Europe is connected to de-radicalisation for Palestinians and makes European action for de-escalation more urgent. And finally, I join with those who remember with sorrow the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin on the 20th anniversary this week of that bloody act. His daughter said in a speech at Mr Rabin's graveside yesterday, "There is no peace process. There is no peace process. Let us hear and agree with her words, and let us create one."
Kiitoksia. Ja seuraavana edustaja Van Orden, olkaa hyvä.
Thank you. Mr. Van Orden.
Conflict in the Middle East, at least we could take some comfort from the fact that for some time Israel wasn't being blamed for the conflicts that were going on. Now we see this new ingredient of Israel-Palestine being dropped into the inferno yet again. I have to say this isn't by accident. I see the hand of Hamas and others at work here, throwing sort of petrol on the fire there. I mean, Mr. Netanyahu, you will know from your conversations, he's repeatedly said that he's willing to engage in negotiations and the peace process without conditions. And I wonder, when you saw Mahmoud Abbas on Monday, Did you actually put this to him? Did you condemn the Palestinian violence, which has brought about the murder of a number of Israelis? Did you remind him, by the way, of the extent to which his Palestine Authority is reliant on EU funding? And did you urge him to take up the Israeli offer immediately of unconditional resumption of negotiations? Thank you.
There is a blue card for you, Mr. Orden. Mrs. Auken.
Two questions. I was a little bit surprised. Do you think it's Hamas who has caused us to talk about and mention the occupation and calling for the occupation to be part of the solution? Because if we don't do that, and I think that is the whole international society, including US, recognizing that this is an occupation. And then secondly, when you talk about unconditional, do you think when we, the international society, ask Israel to stop the illegal settlement building, is that unfair when we call for a true negotiation?
Look, we can go on, going round and round in circles all the time on these issues. The fact is, there is an offer on the table to reopen negotiations. Let's resume those negotiations. And you say, is the hand of Hamas there? Of course it is. Of course it is. Because these people, they only live off the violence that exists amongst the Palestinians. The Palestinian people want to live in peace and prosperity. They've been let down by their leaders over many, many decades now. And it's time to get over this particular problem. Israel and Palestine together, they could create a really vibrant, successful two-state solution in that part of the world. Think of all the benefits that would flow from that. But you've got to stop the terrorism, stop the extremism, and get back to the negotiating table.
And now, nyt edustaja Telitska.
Mr. Telička.
Madam Vice President, I wonder how much does this debate differ from the last one that we had, or from the one before, and I'm afraid that the next debate will be a repetition. I mean, one time it's going to be rockets, terrorist attacks, stabbing, new settlements. Each of us will have his own or her own perception of what is going on. I must say that I do very much appreciate what you have said in terms of the responsibility of Prime Minister Netanyahu and also President Abbas. And I think that this is really something that we need to see delivery from both of them. And I wonder in this respect when finally President Abbas will have the ability to basically administrate Gaza as well. Now, having said this, and I think that in terms of evaluation of what is going on, I very much agree with you, and I also very much appreciate what you said in terms of the three elements and the entry points. My only question really is, if one or the other, or both, fail on the deliveries, do we have the courage, the ability, the unity to provide the right reaction? I believe we have the means, and I think that we should have the rest as well, and I very much trust in your leadership in this respect, that together with the quartet, we really will manage to get these two sides to direct negotiations. One has already declared readiness, the second one should do the same as soon as possible, and I think that unless they deliver, I think we should have another proper answer. Thank you.
Now, Deputy Sylikiotis.
Thank you, Madam President. Mrs. Mogherini, we've got to find ways of getting out of this political dead end, this impasse. The occupation continues. And how can we talk about equidistance at a time when the Israeli army is there and when a child was killed in Jerusalem because he threw a stone. and it does affect people of all walks of life. For example, doctors have been in the firing line as well. What was the reaction from people what would be the reaction of people in the European Union countries if they were if they were denied access, if they were prevented from going to their places of worship? But the root cause is the occupation. As long as it's there, you're going to see no peace, no pacification, and you're going to see a third intifada or a fourth intifada. Mrs. Mogherini, if you want to see peace, then you have got to keep up the pressure on Israel. You've got to weigh up. Should they be able to participate in things such as Horizon 2020? We do have ways of bringing pressure to bear on Israel. Thank you very much.
Kiitoksia. Ja seuraavana edustaja.
Thank you. Mr. ADAKTUSSON.
Madam Speaker, the High Representative keeps addressing the stabbing in Israel by saying that it's vital that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas show leadership and to promote calm. With all the respect, when innocent Israeli civilians are killed in repeated terror attacks, the High Representative of the European Union has to do better. Recent statements by the Palestinian President emphasizes the importance of speaking out. President Abbas claims, and I quote, "The Al-Aqsa Mosque is ours. We bless every drop of blood that has been spilled for Jerusalem." Madam Speaker, two questions must be raised. When will the High Representative loud and clear condemn the Palestinian stabbings of Israeli civilians? When will the Commission deal with the hateful propaganda and anti-Semitism of the Palestinian leadership? Thank you.
Tack. Ja nyt edustaja Pascu, olkaa hyvä.
Thank you. Mr. Pascu.
In the context of the current Sunni-Shia conflict, the old Arab-Israeli conflict until recently dominating the scene has become only one component, and even not the main one, in a much more complex equation. Absolutely, if unattended, this conflict has the potential to make things even worse in that troubled area. But to continue to focus exclusively on it, ignoring the larger picture, is a recipe for failure. I agree that without any prospect, the new generation of Palestinians living in the camps their parents moved in decades ago get angrier and angrier. But equally, we should reject categorically the current wave of stabbings and violence against the Jewish population. Unfortunately, sometimes some of us, convinced that the Palestinians are always right no matter what, forget to equally condemn sincerely such violence, creating an increasingly strong impression that the EU is biased against Israel, whom we might need tomorrow more than we think today, as we did with Turkey. Credible even-handedness is key to the success of our commendable efforts to push the parties into a final deal. Thank you.
Kiitoksia ja seuraavana
Thank you. Mr. Škripek.
Thank you, Mrs. President. Mrs. High Representative, dear colleagues, in debates on this issue I hear often a lot of criticism toward Israel, but only a little towards Palestine. This surprises me. How come that a democratically elected government only gets criticism, and that an authority with a president who was officially chosen until 2009 and still is in function gets all kinds of support? Unfortunately, I notice as well that Mr. Abbas says abroad, what he says abroad is quite contrary to his domestic statements. Publicly, Mr. Abbas is urging for a renewal of the peace process. Domestically, he awarded this week a cartoonist who promotes hate and violence. Publicly, Mr. Abbas said this week that the current situation is extremely serious and grave, and that the young people have no hope. Domestically, he promotes hate in the press and makes no effort to stop this violence and to give anyone hope. Mr. High Representative, we need to unmask these lies from Palestinian authorities. Will you force the authorities to stop this hatred amongst Jews in the Palestinian media? The militant preachers, they really stir up the hate amongst the youth and the people of Palestine. I think we need to stop this.
Kiitoksia. Ja seuraavana edustaja Michel.
Thank you. Ms. Michel.
Frau Mogherini, liebe Kolleginnen und
Mrs. Mogherini, colleagues, the conflict between Israel and Palestine seems to have got ever more out of control. Outbreaks of violence amongst the civilian population on both sides have happened, and they appeared no longer to feel themselves bound by the Oslo Accords, and Netanyahu recently said that a fair two-state solution and our fight against any form of anti-Semitism. Well, Netanyahu and Abbas are allowing this spiral of violence to continue. You say you want to find a point of purchase for the resumption of negotiations, but I suggest that you follow recent initiatives by Israeli writers and intellectuals saying Israel needs cultural bridges rather than boycotts, and also, please apply the same logic to Israel's neighbours, because if hatred and fantasies of annihilation are allowed to flourish and there is no cooperation, then a conflict solution is not likely to grow any closer. But, Mrs. Mogherini, we do need very tangible steps rather than just appeals in order for that to come about.
Ja seuraavana edustaja.
Thank you. A blue card. Would you be willing to accept it?
Yes, Herra Carvieux.
Thank you for taking the blue card. Would you not accept that Israel is taking such steps to build cultural bridges, as demonstrated with regards to the agreement that's been agreed through Jordan with regards to Temple Mount and the Western Wall? Thank you.
And now, Mrs. Michel.
Ja, Herr Kollege.
Well, colleague, if you had listened, you would have understood that that really was exactly what I was pleading for. Cultural values should be involved in this debate. The most recent appeal by writers and intellectuals is, for example, a very tangible way to build bridges rather than to stir up conflict.
Kiitoksia ja seuraavana edustaja Pargneaux.
Thank you. Mr. Pargneaux.
Madam President, Madam High Representative, as you have reminded us with much humanity, Madam High Representative, yet again, we've got to keep our eyes firmly on peace, and that's exactly what you are doing, Madam High Representative. Give peace a chance, finding a two-state solution. I think you have us behind you. We are determined in that direction as well. To maintain your struggle for peace, it's important for both sides to bring leadership to the table, to bear. And we also have to think in terms of mutual comprehension, so we can accompany the process of reconciliation and see what both sides need if they are to sign up to a peace treaty. The quartet, I think, has reached its limits. It's time to cast out, to look for alternatives, and our Arab friends are there and they can help us. That's a real asset, a real trump card. And I believe that with the quartet, with our Arab friends, you, Madam High Representative, are the point of balance, the fulcrum around which we can perhaps find peace, and you have our support. Thank you.
Mr. Krasnodębski.
Dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca.
President, thank you very much. I think I will agree with all those here who have said that it is basically up to Israel, and Israel should open up a perspective for the Palestinians. But it takes two to create peace. Therefore, we should condemn the recent stabbing attacks. Some colleagues here have been quite reticent, and we have been hearing statements to the effect that the Palestinians are okay and no big deal. Therefore, we should try to normalize relations with Israel. Our code of conduct, for instance, does not oblige Palestinian organizations to work towards peace and stability, and even so they get our subsidies. This has to be stopped.
Mr. Khan.
Madam President, the latest developments in the escalation of Israeli-Palestinian violence will not bring about peace. Israeli and Palestinian leaders need to use their authority to curb rather than incite the current wave of violence. There is no sense of future with Israeli systematically eating away at Palestinian land. There is a feeling among Palestinians that no one cares. The two-state solution is at risk of being lost. It must not remain a dream. Violence only brings about more violence. The great danger is of it turning into a religious conflict. There is a lack of attention from the international community. We, the EU, cannot turn our backs on this. People are crying for a solution. We must give them hope. It is the right of every human being to live with dignity, peace and security. Two states living side by side in peace and security. Madam High Representative, as my colleague Mr. Howard asked, when do you plan to adopt and publish the EU guidelines on the labelling of settlements products? Thank you.
Kiitoksia ja seuraavana edustaja Marias.
Thank you. Mr. Marias.
President, the European Union will have to embark on serious initiatives to bring peace to the Middle East. The civil war in Syria, the problems between Israel and the Palestinians will have to be addressed, but we will not solve the problem until we solve the Palestinian issue in the light of the United Nations resolutions. That's the only way that you're going to be able to find peace between the two sides. And if you look at the amount of funding which goes into this for 2015, it's not sufficient for the local population, and certainly not to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It's not going to lead to growth, creation of jobs, investment in a country which, of course, is a fertile breeding ground for extremists. Mrs. Mogherini, you will have to redouble your efforts in order to bring the different sides to the table of negotiation to find a solution there and in the broader region, because continued violence just plays into ISIS hands.
Arena.
Thank you, Mrs. Arena.
Merci.
Thank you. Mrs. Mogherini, first of all, thank you for your statement and your commitment. We cannot allow a sense of fatalism to set in. You have arranged a number of meetings and you have said that tangibly we need to do more. We need to do more to support a restarting of negotiations. We also need to put an immediate end to illegal settlements on the part of the Israelis. Those are two vital prerequisites, the bare minimum for negotiations to be resumed. The European Union does have within its power potential to do more. We have guidelines on products from settlements. We need to activate those guidelines as swiftly as possible so that progress can be made. Thank you.
Kiitoksia ja seuraavana edustaja Lietz.
Thank you, Mr. Lietz.
Madam President, Madam High Representative, the situation in Israel and Palestine is very concerning, and I support the call by the High Representative Federica Mogherini for de-escalation on both sides, Israeli and Palestinian side. It is good that Mrs. Mogherini, together with the US Foreign Minister Kerry and Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, last week called for participation in intensive talks. And it is important that those should now be conducted with all those involved. And I am delighted that a first step has been taken with the camera surveillance on the Temple Mount to calm down the situation and de-escalate it. And we will only get de-escalation if both sides now row back from their rhetoric. I have regretted greatly that the Israeli Premier, ahead of his visit to Germany last week, called the Grand Mufti as the person mainly responsible for the murdering of Jews in Europe. As a historian, it is particularly important to me that the German participation in the Holocaust is not played down, and I would ask you to ensure that MEPs have access to the Gaza Strip, because we have supported the situation. It's important that we now ensure that the humanitarian aid that we have managed to pay is something we can observe being put into place on site.
Thank you. We will now move on to the Catch the Eye procedure, 1 minute apiece. Mr. Milan ZVER first.
Thank you for the floor. Dear Chairman, the blockage in the peace process has opened the door to a new wave of violence caused by radical Israeli groups. Now, this is happening in the shadow of the Syrian war, but we should not underestimate it, because it can reach great dimensions. Violence only results in further violence. Both parties are responsible, but the share of responsibility is not the same. Hamas is supporting last terrorist attacks on Israel. It encourages the plans of terrorist attacks on the Western Bank. It does not want to recognize Israel, and this is discouraging for stability and freedom. Israel has the right to stability, to self-determination. Both parties need to resume negotiations based on the two-state concept. Israel expressed readiness for direct negotiations several times in the past, but President Abbas has declined this. The EU needs to redefine its relation to resolving this issue, and it should not condition its power over Israel by returning to the negotiating table. Thank you.
Mr. Caputo.
Grazie, Presidente. Nelle ultime settimane Madam President, in the past few weeks we've seen a whole new outburst, a flare-up of Israeli-Palestinian violence, which some have termed a new intifada. I hope that we don't end up with another bloody conflict of that kind. Certainly things which are happening, it does seem to be an unprecedented escalation, and it's a symbol, is the emblem of deep rupture and deep fractures between the parties concerned. Resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict must be a priority for the European Union. The constant efforts of the High Representative, Mrs. Mogherini, to find points of commonality are much appreciated. But we do need to have independence and autonomy in the negotiation process. We can only play a part if we recognise that we need two democratic states living side by side in a spirit of reconciliation with safe and guaranteed borders. Thank you very much.
Mr. GERICKE.
Seit September beobachten wir eine neue Welle.
We've seen a new wave of attacks since November of Palestinian terrorists against the Israeli civilian population. At the same time, we once again have experienced a campaign built on lies and myths which simply are not aligned with reality. I think we need to pay careful attention to what's really going on. Israel has not changed its policy vis-à-vis Temple Mount. Since 2014, millions have gone to Temple Mount and have conducted a visit there. Muslims were 3.5 million, 200,000 were Christian, 12,000 were Jews, and only the Muslims are allowed to pray there. I think Israel is doing a lot to ensure that all faiths beliefs are upheld, and you've got Friday, Saturday and Sunday as holy days that have to be taken into consideration. I'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you.
Seuraavana edustaja Couso.
Thank you. Mr. Couso.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, President. Thank you to the High Representative. Another horrendous chapter in the story of occupation that has gone on for far too long. Awful acts are being perpetrated, triggered by despair. Decades of occupation. We have seen extrajudicial executions carried out, assassinations. We have even seen people that have been shot and then stabbed. It is out of all proportion. Mrs. Mogherini, it is in all our interest to resolve the problem. The European Union does have the power to influence the situation. There are UN resolutions, 242, for example, that calls for all occupied territories to be freed up. Thank you. Mr. Maragall. Mrs. Mogherini, I agree with you that it is not business as usual. We acknowledge that you have shown tenacity and promoted dialogue, but there are plenty of risks if we just stick with fine words and fine declarations. The European Union should not ask and request Israel and the Palestinian territories. How can the European Union take action with or without the quartet? How can we influence and shape the process? We are still talking about shared responsibility on both sides, as if the Palestinians were not drowned and stymied, and their very existence in a straitjacket. So how do you think that you can manage relations between the Arab community and Israel? Do you believe that a number of the settler groups should be included in the list of banned groups in the EU? And what about factories that are used to manufacture weapons in Israel? How should they be handled? Thank you.
Olkaa hyvä.
Η θηριωδία του Ισραηλινού κράτους τοπικού.
Thank you very much. Madam President, Israel is the local policeman of world capitalism and imperialism, and the pipe dreams and pious hopes which are expressed in all of our resolutions on the subject talk about a peaceful future, but the fact is that the main interest there is oil. That is what has got people at each other's throats. It's in order to gain control over the hydrocarbons and the oil resources. And yet we are looking for forms of economic cooperation with Israel. But I think that we will not see the way ahead until we recognize that we have got to have a solution which pays attention, which factors in the legitimate demands of the Palestinian people and can draw on international solidarity. And the Communist Party of Greece sees itself in the vanguard of that fight. Thank you very much.
Mr. Frunzulică.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm deeply concerned about developments in Israel and Palestine, which threaten to make a two-state solution impossible. Stabbing, car rammings and shooting attacks make it clear that the situation is more and more unstable and difficult. Both sides need to explore together ways to stop violence first, to calm down the situation, to show leadership and to make sure that there are not additional people losing their lives. Our objective must remain a two-state solution with a democratic and viable Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security of Israel that has to receive all necessary guarantees considering its security and stability and with its other neighbours. If an agreement to finally end the conflict is reached, the door would be open for development and cooperation in the area. At the same time, everybody is speaking about two sides. I think, Mrs. Mogherini, that the Palestinians have to be encouraged by us to realize the common side, and I refer to Fatah and Hamas movements. They have to bridge and to come with a common side to the negotiations. Thank you.
Kiitoksia ja seuraavana edustaja.
Thank you. Mr. Sakurafa.
Mr. Sakarafa. Mrs. Mogherini, I'm very glad to see you sitting there today at a time when Israel is engaging in further rounds of ethnic cleansing and bearing down on the population of Gaza. The sad fact is that the Middle East situation demonstrates, if any proof was needed, the failure of anyone's attempts at finding peace. When Mr. Netanyahu can say that a mufti was responsible for giving Hitler the idea, that gives you an idea of how far the rhetoric has gone. And the fact is that we should at least implement the agreements that we have already. The association agreement should be immediately revoked, or rather should be immediately suspended. Israel should not be able to participate in our various programs. Otherwise, the terrorist state in the region is going to continue its murderous policy. Thank you.
Our final speaker, Mr. Viegas.
Palestinianos querem é muito simples. O fim da ocupação.
Yes, the Palestinians want something quite simple, which is a free and independent state, a state which is within the borders of this 67 agreement. And for decades, Israel has been promoting state terror, and various forms of arrests have taken place of Palestinians, and people have had their property removed, and yet the pressure has been maintained in the form of provocations, checkpoints, selective murders, and the situation in the Gaza Strip is completely untenable. And the international community and the upholding of human rights is a situation in which the European Parliament must ensure that every possible influence is brought to bear to ensure that the problem is sorted out peacefully.
I will give the floor to Commissioner Mogherini. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as one speaker said during this debate, we have always the same debate. And let me say very frankly, as you know me by now, I always tend to be, when we say this is not time for business as usual, that's also for us. That's also for us. Because here we see again and again, within political families even, within political families, within the groups, the same split. Some of you asking me for having a stronger voice when we condemn acts of terror, which we do, and some of you asking me to have a stronger voice when we call for the end of occupation, which we do. Both. And please have a look, a serious one, not only at my statements, but also at the last, just a few days ago, statement of the Quartet, which means that this is common positions not only of all the European Union united, but also of the international community through the Quartet. And this is a common position we have built. And let me say, a common position of the European Union and of the international community through the Quartet much more united than within your own political groups you are able to manage. This is not time for us only to call for something or to condemn something. Do we realise that we are in a serious, dramatic situation? Could be the end of the Oslo framework. Do we realise that or not, we here in this room? So, if I see on the two sides, in my talks in this last couple of days, as I told you in the beginning of our debate, if I see that, if I hear, I don't see it yet, if I hear readiness from both sides to work together, to restart talks, and to work together on implementing some measures on the ground, I ask you in this room, what do you think our role as European Union is? To condemn and to call for something, or to try to bring them to do this? I believe our role is the second one. Also because I don't see many actors now pushing for playing this role in this moment. There's plenty of other crises competing with this one, and we Europeans are one of the few ones still focusing much on this. But we have to do it with the right approach, trying to help them to get out of this bubble. I'm also an historian by studies, and I love history, but the problem we have here is that there is too much history. There's too much history. And if someone doesn't help the parties and the people, the Israelis and the Palestinians, and not only the Israelis and the Palestinians, the whole region, to get out of the bubble of history and try to look at how to manage the common future they have committed to. Nobody else will do it. So I believe our role is to play a diplomatic role, which is not a nice exercise, good intentions. It's very hard. It's very tough. It's not again, naive. It's a reality check that we have to do here also. It's a reality check. We risk that the Oslo framework is gone. Someone said in the beginning of the debate, I think it was Gianni PITTELLA, we are losing generations. There are generations in Israel and in Palestine that don't believe in the two states anymore, on both sides. There are young people that believe either in no state at all or in one state only, on both sides. I believe that Oslo framework is still a valid perspective for both, with all that goes with that. But we are at the edge. It's not going to continue like this. So this is what I'm trying to do, passing the message that to the leaderships and hopefully to the people also, but to the people it's not my job only. You wanted two states, you say you wanted two states, either you do something now on this or it's gone. Or it's gone. And then we don't have the safety net of a plan B. We have to reinvent it if we get out of the Oslo framework. It's not anymore about what we call for or what we condemn. Then it's a totally different story. And the world doesn't need another complication in the region. That's why I say, of all the conflicts we have, this one, to me, is one of the most urgent, because its global ramifications go everywhere in the world. And the presence of the holy sites makes it even more serious. And this is paradoxically also the conflict that, if there is enough political will, can be solved, because we have been discussing, they have been discussing this for decades, how it should look like in the end. And there is, someone was rightly pointing out at that, and there is an Arab peace initiative that can provide a regional framework for security and for peace. So the point to me is, and I would invite you to go back to the spirit with which you discussed this issue in September. That was a constructive one. That was a useful one. That gave us strength in the last month to gather the international community behind our proposals, our positions, and to bring the parties to start looking at, can we do something together? There are moments where violence is higher, like this one, that could also be the turning point in a crisis, because the parties realize that they're risking too much internally. Violence in Israel comes also from the inside. And the situation inside the West Bank is tense so much that both leaderships realize, I think today, that it's in their own interest. It's in their own interest to tackle this seriously, finally. I might be wrong. It could be that this is not leading anywhere. And then, yes, sure, we will need to see, together with our friends in the rest of the international community, what do we do with that. But my role in this moment, and I would ask us Europeans to be united on this, is to try and see if there is one chance for the two sides to start doing something useful on the ground instead of having their people killing each other, to facilitate this to happen. Because we're not going to have many chances in the future. There is a sense that I feel of urgency and dramatic moment that has come. I don't think this is just another chapter of a long story. The situation is different today. It's different. As always, I didn't follow my notes. So I believe that this is what we can do. We can come back in another month or another month and a half and discuss about our statements, our options, our condemning, our urging, our statements, whatever. Yes. In the meantime, we need to try and bring them together. Again, together with our Arab friends, together with the international community. But this is our work. This is our work. And I think, I'm sure, that this Parliament will support this effort. This is a crisis where the European Union has a lot to spend in terms of political capacity. I said it 1 year exactly ago in the hearing in AFET. This is the crisis where we are the biggest player if we want to transform the money we spend, the economic, political, cultural relation we have with both sides, into political capital. This is what we are building strongly. Obviously, this is not completely in our hands, because peace cannot be imposed from the outside. But what can be done from the outside is the facilitation and the push for serious, as I said, shift of policy to happen. And I think that in these dramatic conditions, the parties have all the interest in doing this for real. Thank you.
The debate is closed. The next item on the agenda is statement by the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, situation in South Sudan.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And let me apologize if sometimes I'm a little bit too passionate in my statements. Normally it happens in the end of the debates, not in the beginning, so I try to go back to my normal tone of voice. And I would like to start by thanking you for keeping a focus on South Sudan and for organizing this debate. I think it is very important that we keep focused on that. This is a country where huge hopes faded in just a space of a few years. It is a country that could be rich if it fully used its natural resources. And on the contrary, we have a humanitarian situation that is dire. We have some 30,000 people currently risking death by starvation, and thousands more that are on the brink of famine according to UN data. 1 million people are internally displaced. Over 700,000 fled the country. One of the biggest refugee crises today, and I would like us to focus on the refugee crises that are happening in the world, also when they are happening outside our own borders or regions. Innocent civilians continue to suffer human rights abuses. At least 80 civilians were reportedly killed over the last 3 weeks, and a further 150 civilians have reportedly been killed since Friday, 23rd of October, in Unity State alone. Meanwhile, humanitarian organisations still have no access to this area. The sexual violence against women and children has reached shocking levels, and these crimes go against the commitments made by all parties in South Sudan, commitments to protect its citizens and put an end to the human rights violations. The people of South Sudan cannot wait. Justice and reconciliation must be central to our efforts to lay the foundation for sustainable peace. For this reason, we welcome the African Union's decision to publish the Commission of Inquiry's report and to move ahead with the establishment of the hybrid court. The recent peace agreement offers really a unique opportunity, one that cannot be missed. It is an opportunity for South Sudan to move towards a transparent, accountable government, a government that places the interests of the citizen above all else. And if properly implemented, the agreement will end the fighting. It will install transitional institutions to rebuild the country. The government's decision to increase the number of federal states in the country goes against the spirit and the letter of the agreement. The same goes for the reluctance of the opposition to commit to the implementation of the security arrangements. The recent clashes in the Unity State and the worrying signs of growing crackdown on civil societies, they're all worrying, very worrying events. Just yesterday in Addis, the parties took a first step to move beyond the current deadlock. This gives us hope that the discussion can get to the next stage. But let me say that a positive conclusion of the dialogue is still not in sight. Only a timely implementation of the agreement will lead to real peace, end the suffering of the people of South Sudan, and stop the humanitarian tragedy. Spoilers on all sides must understand that there are consequences for their actions, and there will be. There are a number of steps that must be taken now. First, ceasefire must come into place as a matter of urgency. And second, all obstacles to full and unconditional humanitarian access must be removed immediately. With statehood comes responsibility. Hard work begins now with the implementation of the agreement. South Sudan cannot afford that this agreement follows the same path of all past broken ceasefire agreements. For that, we need to sustain international pressure and cohesion. We all have welcomed the continued efforts of IGAD and the African Union in reaching this deal, and the constructive engagement of Sudan, Uganda, Ethiopia and Kenya. I met exactly 1 week ago in Addis with the African Union's chairperson, Dr. Zuma, and with the Ethiopian Prime Minister. We agreed to keep working together to help South Sudan. In the implementation phase, regional unity is essential and plays a key role. With regard to the regional challenges, I recall the conclusions adopted yesterday by the Council of the EU Horn of Africa Regional Action Plan on 2015-2020, which outlines the European Union's comprehensive approach to address the key issues in the region. We will also need a strong monitoring body representing the South Sudanese civil society, together with regional